This is Baha'i. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I just made my first mistake at the night. I've always called it Baha'i. That is not what they like. Baha'ism is actually considered a derogatory phase, and it's called the Baha'i faith. So officially, when you refer to it, we say Judaism or Christianity, or when we said Hinduism is kind of a miscategorization of them. But when we refer to the Baha'i faith, we should say that word faith is also included as a part of it. Now, I will probably make that mistake a dozen or several dozen times in the next hour, so please, but I will try to get it. What I want to do today is, in addition to our standard categories, we're gonna look at a little bit of just sort of the general idea of Baha'i and what it is, and its sort of its thoughts and its basis. I want to talk about its history, which is not very old, yet also very old. It has three principles, not surprisingly, much like Zoroastrianism, as we discovered last week. Three principles that undergird it. They're different principles, but there is some connective tissue in them. We'll talk about the number 9 and how it is important to Baha'i, to the Baha'i faith, and to those who follow it. And then I do want to go and obviously compare it to Christianity. And it's strange. When we compare Judaism and Christianity and Islam, we work in categories and we showed nuances. Zoroastrianism, when we got to Hinduism and Buddhism, that's an entirely different world system. So we're putting aside our categories and we're rethinking in new categories. And even if we try to import those other categories onto those Eastern religions, it's difficult. So we have to step outside of that. Last week in Zoroastrianism, we talked about the base. I mean, as we talked about, there were so many categories that overlapped. I mean, like almost every category of faith or belief we have, which does beg the question: is how was Islam, Christianity, or how was Judaism, Christianity, and Islam informed ultimately by Zoroastrianism? And the answer to that can be found in Baha'i. And so there is this connective tissue. And so when we talk about Baha'i, the best way I can put it as we go in is it is the ever-present unification of world religions as an expression of God's manifestation of God's self through history and time. And let me put that in more. Baha'i believes at its B-A-H-A with an accent over it, an apostrophe, and an I with an accent, I believe, going the other way. But it's pronounced, and we pronounce it in English, Baha'i, and then faith. No, that's great. If you have a question, ask it. If you were to break Baha'i down into the general cosmology of the world and the ordering of the world, essentially you would have Sabianism, which is being one of the earliest forms of, or what they consider one of the earliest forms of religious expression, through Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, what's called Bab, meaning gate or door, which is the beginning of the Baha'i religion, and Baha'i faith. It's telling me we're here. And there are 9 world religions that Baha'i covers in terms of what it believes it is meant to express. And they believe that each one of those faiths are a part of the evolving, progressive expression of God. In other words, God started to manifest himself, the creator, and very much sounds like a Judeo-Christian God. I mean, creator God, omnipotent, and we'll talk about those categories shortly. But it's as if God said, I'm going to create the world, and they believe in a creator God that created out of nothing, that put time and material world into existence. And then those earlier yearnings of early people, Neanderthals or wherever, and this is where it gets a little fuzzy because they both acknowledge and deny some of the sacred texts, but they would believe that there's early yearnings of human beings, that were formed in Zoroastrianism as being one of the oldest faiths, that were then refined in Judaism, that were then refined in Christianity, and then expressed as those things were emerging also in Hindu, along the same line in the East, Hinduism and Buddhism. But as we talked about Islam being that they see themselves as an extension of Islam, of Judaism, Christianity, and then Islam, like it in the same way we see ourselves as an extension of Judaism. Judaism was the beginning, like of God's covenant with humanity, and we are the fullest expression of that. Well, the Muslims are like, no, we're the fullest expression of that. Well, Baha'i would say, no, you're all wrong. Baha'i faith is the fullest expression, or the most current, or the widest or broadest expression of God's intersection with humanity through these 9 world religions. So in other words, all these world religions lead to the same God manifested in multiple different ways. Now, pluralism is a word that we throw around in religious conversation, and that pluralism usually means, or generally means, that there is a plurality of expressions of paths to God. Pluralists or universalists would believe all paths lead to God. Baha'i would say not all paths lead to God, all paths lead to an expression or a manifestation of God, with Baha'i faith being the fullest or most recent, I guess, or broadest expression of who God is. Let me stop there before we move any further, because that's an important concept to grasp as we put this together. I see some confused faces. Yes, what?
I didn't grasp it.
Okay.
The difference between pluralism.
Well, pluralism is just the sense of that all paths lead to God. It's the same God. There's a oneness in God. And Baha'i would agree with that. There's one God, and every single world religion is and so all the way starting I don't know how to pronounce it, Sabianism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and alongside Judaism, Hinduism, and then expansion of Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and then the last 2 religions that relate to the Baha'i faith. Each one of these are a progressive expansion and revelation of who God is. In other words, Jesus, Buddha, the first Buddha or enlightened one, Muhammad, Abraham, these were all prophets that revealed something new about God, but it's progressive. It gets more and more and more. And Baha'i faith focuses on the number 9, and it's throughout a number of things, but in particular because 9 is the highest single digit, and so it's considered the fullness of completion. There's something higher than 1, there's something higher than 5, there's something higher than 8, but 10 requires 2 numbers. So 9 is a sacred number for them. So if you go to a Baha'i temple, it has 9 sides. They represent the 9 religions of the world that all are God manifesting himself in a new and progressive and advanced way. Yes.
Quick question about that. It may not be an answer to it, but I'm just wondering if they acknowledge that they might be one of these expressions, and there might be something that comes after them.
They do actually. They acknowledge, strangely enough, that, well, they consider the founder of this, although there's a precursor. There's kind of a John the Baptist figure, but the name is Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah or something, I don't know how to pronounce these words, but that is actually the messianic figure that was talked about by Abraham. So Jesus was not the Messiah. Jesus was a prophet of revelation. And therefore, because of that, all of the sacred texts of all of these 9 religions all are counted as having, and we'll talk about how they view text, as having important information in them and containing some aspect or revelation of truth in them. But what I want you to realize as we go into it is that it's progressive and it's all unified. So the same God, the Zoroastrianism, and this is why I said last week that Zoroastrianism and Baha'i are connected, because Zoroastrianism was one of the first of world religions that identified a monotheistic understanding of God, and Baha'i does as well. But that God, as culture advanced and changed, continued to reveal himself in various ways And the Baha'i faith is our current and most faithful expression or fullest expression. But there is some doctrine that believes that in 1,000 years after Baha'u'llah, that there will be another prophet. That could, there, and I didn't get to go too deep down that rabbit trail, but that's the important thing to realize as we talk about this. It is the unification of these 8 expressions of faith into one. So for Baha'i, you could be Baha'i and primarily be a Christian because you're just sort of stuck back here in the Christian phase. Or you could be Jewish because you're stuck back here in the, not stuck is probably not the right word, but that is where you're at in your process. But in any of them, they all have this system, as we'll talk about shortly, of kind of like we do, but it's well, I mean, in the sense of deed-based, merit-based afterlife. What you do in this life has an effect. So as a consequence, not surprisingly, if they're trying to unify the 8 world, or what they would consider the 8 world religions up to this point, they are trying to find common things in all of them, or express common things in all of them, and in each one of those things, it leads to basically an afterlife where they describe, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but they describe heaven and hell not to be physical places of punishment and reward, or reward and punishment, but of nearness and farness from God. So, all right, well, let's get into it. And feel free to interrupt if you need to. It is an Abrahamic, it is considered Iranian, it is considered highly influenced by Persian against the Zoroastrianism. It is monotheistic. The language or the doctrines are written primarily, and their sacred texts are written primarily in 3 languages: Persian, Arabic, and English. It was only founded in the 19th century, and we'll go back to that in a few moments. And it has grown to be the fastest growing, it's the newest world religion identified, with 5 to 8 million adherents. And it is the fastest growing, and in the stats from 1910 to 2000, one of you has, I need to, Danny, it was recorded as the fastest growing world religion from 1910 to 2010. It outgrew in conversion that of the twice as much as the population of all UN countries. So in UN countries, the manner in which the population grew, the Baha'i adherents grew twice as much. And they went from, in 1950, 200,000 worldwide to 1980 to 4 million, which also means that since 1980 to the present day, there's another 4 million that were added. So it is the second, I said it was the fastest. It was the fastest in that century, but it is considered the second fastest because Islam is still actually considered the first.
What's the biggest concentration?
Sub-Saharan Africa has just under 30%, and Southeast Asia has just under 27%. And then they're scattered. They do not consider, though, and they actually reject any sort of national association. It just happens to be where the growth is. And that's actually pretty explicit. They're trying to say, no, we're not associated with any particular, although we have an origin in Iran or Persian sort of influence, it is very important to them that there is no national association along with Baha'i faith. I get used to saying that. There is a Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel, interestingly enough, in the Holy Land. Yeah, I thought that was really, I thought, when I was reading, I was thinking it would be like somewhere in Iran, but no, it's there, where they have something called the Universal House of Justice, which also has 9 elected officials. So this 9 keeps coming up, and again, they see it as this sort of number of completion, of perfection. And so they're based out of Israel. At its core, they promote the worth of all religions and the unity of all human people, of humanity. in other words, and they have a great respect for material world, for nature, for animals, but their central concentration is the flourishing of humanity, and therefore it has a very, as I'm reading, I'm like, there's nothing, there's some good stuff here in sense of peace and harmony, and their goal is ultimately world peace. It is a religion, someone said it is a religion that is revealed in an orderly, and this is, and progressive. And what this means is those 9 religions is considered a further revelation of who God is in a progressive way, but in an orderly way from the divine's perspective, but it acknowledges that our human understanding of that is broken. And therefore, the sacred texts that we have, as we'll talk about soon, are actually filled with flaws and errors because they're human documents that describe the relationship of the divine and human. But in each one of them, there is an infallible truth that's there, exists. And it's for Baha'i finding that commonality of that truth throughout all of them. And arguably we all are promoting peace. We're all promoting serving our neighbor. We're all, we're all promoting some of these basic things that just, and I think that shouldn't, sometimes Christians are like, oh, it's not all the same. No, we're not all the same. We're totally different. But what we can agree on is that Buddhists and Hindus and Christians, and at the core of what these religions believe, all of them are promoting some sense of peace, some sense of harmony, some sense of even tolerance on some levels. I mean, there's nothing about Christianity that's like hate your neighbor. No, it's just the opposite. Love your enemy. Turn the other cheek. Although I dare I say it in this gun-toting region of the world, but non-violent, peaceful resistance is a part of the gospel. What do you think turn the other cheek is? And we can't deny that, and we nuance it how we'd like to, but, Jesus was a pacifist. I know some of you are like, we need a Bible study on that. So it's one religion revealed through an orderly and progressive way by one God, the unity of God, through manifestations. And each of those prophets that we had that are associated, Zoroaster from like last week, and Gautama from Hinduism, and the Buddha from Buddhism, and well, no, they wouldn't go there. No, not Joseph. We'll get to that. They probably would consider that a cult for a number of reasons. I didn't go into that, but that'll be interesting to figure that out. But all the founders of the major world religions are considered manifestations of God and of God's being and presence and a new way of structuring. And what's interesting about that is that means that sometimes other customs are left. So at one time you couldn't eat pork, now you can. So Christianity allowed for pork. So at the time and place where pork was a prohibition for Hindus and for Jews, and they've carried that on, Christianity being a progression of that universal faith expression, it's like, you can eat pork. And so it becomes more and more open, more and more accepting to many things, so long as all of these religions are promoting peace and love and harmony, sort of thing. The Baha'i faith believes that all world religions are under one unified purpose, and that it would be world peace, unification of the world. And they actually take it to an nth degree. Like when you talk about the things that it promotes, they promote they believe in a world federation. And this is where you get into Christianity, where it gets into a little bit of the dodginess of the sort of end times. And, when the EU, I remember when the EU was unifying, I was thinking, is this sort of like one of those things? Or, world global health, or those sort of things. That unification under an antichrist is what we in Christianity would say a sign of the end times. But they believe in a world federation. That would sort of combine, that would unify the whole world. They believe in a universal language. That there should be a universal language. They believe in a standard economy, that there should be a common currency through the whole world that we can use. Standard system of measurement, which I do actually agree with. This whole imperial UK stuff, I just need to dump and go with metric system. That's just my 2 cents. So it's just, Anything based off of some guy's foot is a problem to me. Universal education, we strongly believe in that. An international court that would be that would mediate between nations, like kind of like the UN, but but all nations have sort of submitted themselves to that. And the phrase that came up was world embracing collective security. And so it's the idea that the world, everywhere there's a sense of equality. I mean, it would be global socialism, essentially, is what it would be. So, which I know is a a hot topic or a buzzword for folks these days, but Jesus was actually the first probably socialist. New Testament church, giving all your money and distributing as need. I don't know how you get around that as a socialist agenda. So, for another Bible study, they strongly reject many isms, among them racism, because it separates different nations from one another, and there's meant to be a unification. Sexism, they're strong into the idea that men and women are equal and offer, and I think that Christianity is moving that. A lot of religions, in that sense, are moving that way, and I would call that I think men and women will never be looked and should never be looked as the same, but the sameness is not the same as equal. Equality or equity, in God's eyes, there were differences, and we need to go back to the creation account, but there was equity, there was harmony, there was balance, there was mutuality and reciprocity, and that was lost in the fall. And I think that with the Holy Spirit's help over the last 2,000 years, we've seen strides toward that, and I think we're seeing some of that in our current culture today. Nationalism is a huge problem, because and strongly, I mean, like one of the big no-nos I wrote somewhere, I don't know where it's at, partisan politics is forbidden. So if you're a Baha'i faith, you may not associate with any sort of official party. And I gotta be honest with you, I kind of agree with that. I've made that argument myself. If Christianity as a whole, not that they couldn't vote Democrat, Independent, Republican, but if Christianity as a whole stopped aligning themselves with parties, those parties would stop using our faith as political tools for their own power. And we could still vote the politics that we have, but without giving them and allowing them, the parties, to use our faith as, for their own gain. So, because there's a dangerous reciprocal relationship where then those parties begin to form what our faith looks like on both sides of the spectrum. They believe in a united order of humanity, essentially. And the last thing I would say, what did I write here? Religious history, or what we've talked about, all those 9 religions, is the broadening and advanced, it consists of broadening and advanced revelations rendered through sacred texts of varying levels of reliability. So in other words, they look at all the sacred texts of those 9 religions and say, yeah, there's some truth there, but they have varying levels of reliability, but they all contain the essence or the substance of truth for that time and place in human history. Again, the progressive nature of it. Zoroastrian, the doctrines that existed there were what was needed there. And this is an Abrahamic faith, so it takes the same characters of all the categories.
Do they have their own sacred texts?
They do, but they are considered, again, in the spectrum of the advancement or progression, they're considered the fullest, but it's all alongside all the other sacred texts.
So they don't combine them?
No, but this is where syncretism comes into play, that they, one religion influences the other. This is why Zoroastrian looks a lot like Christianity. Well, but Zoroastrian predates Christianity, so did we get more from them than they got from us? Probably, to some extent. Or the categories were already there. And according to the Baha'i faith, those categories are God-given categories that were revealed through time and space, even in the Eastern religions. That in other words, there's some aspect of truth that still exists in that, although not everything is reliable. And Baha'i faith would not acknowledge reincarnation. So that's where some of those unreliable doctrines or beliefs would come into play in the Eastern religions, because they do actually believe that in the body and the end of the body and the soul's union. So there, yeah, so I wrote, therefore laws and customs can change, but the basics of the faith of caring for neighbors, serving others, drawing closer to God, these sort of things undergird all of it together. Okay, let me stop there before I go on. Any questions? Yes,
So
nice and loud.
they don't allow for, I mean, I know you say very reliability of the text, but what if one of these religions just really went off in a wrong direction? They just assumed that every new development was adding truth. Could it not have been
Yes,
gone way to the,
yes, they do acknowledge that, and they acknowledge that that truth was represented or brought forth and manifested at the time and place that that truth was needed. And that the next truth, so that means that Christianity is in fact a correction or an advancement of Judaism, and Islam is an advancement or correction to some of the things of Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. And so what they're looking at is the entire history of world religion. That's what I'm saying. It's the newest in the sense of it's the newest world recognized religion. But in the case of Joseph Smith or Mormons, it's not a world religion. And so in some sense, just a sociological term is the plausibility structure of humanity, or the social construction of how we construct our society relies on a plausibility structure. If everyone agrees about this, then we get along fine. 2 + 2 is 4. Everyone agree? What is 2? It's an English word to represent 2 units. What are 2 units? I'm using words to define words. In other words, the symbolism of the idea of the mathematic conception of these, 2 or whatever word you want to put on the word 2 equaling, 2 + 2 = 4 is a mathematical concept that we put stuff on and we put words around, but we all, across all nations and peoples, agreed to that, into the mathematical purity of that. We assign different language around it, but there's a plausibility structure that allows us to communicate. We all buy into this idea that this is a truth. Yeah.
but we as Christians would agree that Islam was an improvement or a further development of the beliefs of Christianity.
As nor would Judaism for us, as probably Zoroastrians or Hindus, everyone, Hindus probably look at Buddhists and be like, oh, you're messing things up, just the way. So this is what differentiates us as Christians.
I mean, they have a lot of faith in the human ability to develop greater truth.
Yes, and all of this comes from Revelation. Our faith comes from Revelation as well, not only through our patriarchs. It was a revelation or an encounter that Abraham had with God, that Noah had, Noah, and Abraham was, Judaism was established, or Yahwehism was established, but that was an encounter with God, a revelation with God, and it was recorded and passed on and shared. Well, do I think that they're making, do I think Islam is making up something like there's not really a guy named Muhammad? No, I think there genuinely was. And I think, did he have an encounter with some sort of divine? Yeah, I can't deny his life experience. Do I think what happened to Muhammad is truth? No, because we believe that Christ is the fullest expression of who God is in this world, and the fullest revelation of God. And the Bible carries that story or that narrative. That tells us about the fullest revelation of who God is. And so everything after is a misalignment of that. Yeah.
Well, then how could a Christian be Bahá'í? Because if he believes what you just said about Christ, how can he believe all?
Well, I didn't say I thought Christians could be Bahá'í. The Bahá'í faith believed that you can still, because there's a lot of Christians who have a pretty loose Christology. There's a lot, and regardless, that's not a liberal or conservative thing either. Liberals fashion their God a certain way, so do conservatives, and across the spectrum, we're all guilty of fashioning some sense of who we believe God is, or who Christ is, or what happened on the cross, which most people couldn't really express. If I said, here's a piece of paper, tell me what you think actually happened on the cross, most Christians in the world would not be able to. Jesus died for our sins is what it would come out. Well, how does that work? They don't know. So, Yeah,
Well, and from what you read or hear, a lot of the younger folks believe in a higher power. They don't necessarily call it
Yeah,
God,
yeah.
which is a lot of what they're talking about. And then they're kind of looking for middle ground, but they don't buy into the Christianity thing.
Well,
wholeheartedly.
and millennials were, I mean, Gen Xers, my generation was the first to sort of have a beginning of this sort of deistic, and it comes out of this period of early evangelicalism, Billy Graham accepting your personal savior, and then our parents both were working, so we were left home as latchkey kids, and we developed this deistic, our parents are away, but they care about us, but they're not with us, we don't see them. Well, that same view of parent was expressed on God by my generation. God's real, but God's far away. God doesn't care that I'm setting fire to the street, which I wish I did when I was a kid. I found a lot of chemicals in the garage, and if you put a lot of pine needles on a tar road, you'd be surprised at how quickly you can light that puppy up. Well, how did I get it? I think to myself, how did I get away with that? If Sal's was out lighting 5th Street, Avenue, I'd be like, what are you doing? But no, I think there is some sense of a loose Christology of view. I mean, in other words, Christ becomes the main primary prophet. They probably look at Christians who find themselves as stuck.
Okay, so what is the concept of sin?
Okay.
How do they see that in the structure?
That the concept of sin has been revealed through all of these different religions in different ways, and what they would acknowledge is not necessarily the origin of sin, but the presence of sin. And that sin is self-preservation and, destruction, I probably hit these words, prejudice, all these things, and the opposite of sin is peace and harmony, and that we ought to be seeking that.
Is there a confession that they recommend you do?
What do you mean in terms of confession?
We confess our sins, do they?
They have prayers and meditations that lend themselves to that, but not necessarily even Roman Catholics and Protestants don't confess sins in the same way.
No.
Even in church on Sunday, I say in the Reformed tradition, this is what we do, acknowledging, that not everyone views it the same way. In the Assemblies of God, I grew up praying before I went to bed every night for fear that if I died, I would go to hell. So
do we in Catholics.
but that's why I like Luther, sin boldly, if you're going to, covered by grace, all that good stuff.
Jason,
Yeah.
how does a person know as an individual what they should do? I'm a Christian because my parents were Christian. That's
Yeah.
the way I was brought up. But if you study what we are learning here, how do we know what's the best thing to do?
So typically our understanding or our knowledge of God is mediated by a number of sources. One would be Scripture, or the primary one would be Scripture. And there's the idea that there's a self-authenticating, that we would say that the Spirit helps us see that as an authoritative source. The community of faith, and that means our creeds, our doctrines, the history of the church, the history of Israel, all of that factors into our understanding. Just the history of the general faith. Our denomination is considered, where we find ourselves, and some people find themselves in that. But prior to the 1950s, typically there weren't non-denominational churches. Most of the time you associate with something that had some sort of establishment or something official. Personal revelation, which has varied in its value. Communal revelation was valued at sometimes greater than personal revelation. Personal revelation can get a little dodgy at times. God told me this. God told me I should marry you. Oh, really? God didn't tell me that. And in a Bible college growing up, we had Assemblies of God. Boy, phrase was thrown out a lot. That's always the big joke. God told me we're supposed to be together. Well, God has not revealed that to me yet. And so there are multiple ways that we gain faith, but ultimately it comes down to, I think, for the Christian faith, a personal revelation with God. All these elements add up, but it's not one over the other. It is often the proclamation of the gospel, that sense of truth, or reading of the word that reveals that truth to us. Or sometimes it's just the Spirit of God in a completely arbitrary, non-textual way, where some people have an experience with God on the mountain and they feel God's presence and they're like, and it's so profound that they can't deny it. So it differs for individuals.
You don't necessarily have to have that revelation.
No, you don't.
You can still be a Christian and believe.
No, yeah, absolutely. And honestly, and I'm not one to judge any Christian for anything. I'm just I'm just like, that's not my job. Like I like to say, God didn't send Jesus to condemn the world, so he probably didn't send you. But I do think that there is some sense of, personal encounter with God.
In my experiences, looking back, I see that experience more than present.
Yes.
I see where God has influenced me and helped me.
Well, it is, and honestly, like Calvin writes about this too. Not everyone who proclaims to be God, who claims to be Christian, is actually Christian. That's what the text was that we looked at on Sunday. Or maybe two Sundays. The idea of sowing some soil, some seeds spurt up, and they grow, and they even produce fruit, but in the end, they're strangled out. And so there are some who will follow faith with the earnest, and honestly, and the interpretation that from the Christian perspective of world religions will be that some have faith in that and they fall away, but others still also in other religions have faith and produce good things and good fruit, but in the end, they haven't found the truth themselves. So back here first, before you.
Yeah, I was, years ago, my husband and I were good friends.
Nice and loud so the folks online can do it.
Okay, we were good friends with some Bahá'í people who gave converting us a go. And so we went to quite a few meetings. And you reminded me, I forgot a lot of it, but you reminded me about, what do we do, And in there, you'll probably get into this, but in their sacred text, there are some practices. Like
Yeah.
They don't drink alcohol, they don't drink coffee, I don't think either, the substances.
I didn't get into the nitty gritty of it, but I know alcohol and selling alcohol is also prohibited. Anything related to alcohol is prohibited. So.
Health is a big.
Let me see if I don't know if I can. Gossiping, strangely enough, drinking, sex outside of marriage, politics, begging, and I'm sure that there is that was just sort of it's very much like no gossiping. Yeah, Lake City. Yeah, Baha'i will never take a hold of Lake City. No, yeah, and interestingly enough, since we're talking about it, is there someone? Oh, someone's. Interesting, I gotta turn this off. Interestingly enough, that marriage is considered pretty sacred, and one of the basic building structures of society, which they carry a pretty traditional view. Like, no sex outside of marriage, no homosexuality, views the family as the foundation for society, but they encourage strong encouragement of interracial marriage, and that's considered something highly praised. But then again, the unification of humanity. And I'll say this, as a biracial person who's half Filipino and half white, I get that. I've often said, if you want to solve racism in the world, intermingle because it's at one point in New York, there was a difference between the Irish and the English and the Italians and the Germans and the Polish and all of these, Italian, I guess, are probably have a little more color, pigment in their skin, but all of these white ethnic groups eventually just became a homogenized group. And that's eventually that's not just happened there, that's happened in places all over the world. Israel, for crying out loud, how homogenized with all the different nations, Persians, all the influences that they've had over the years. There's no such thing as a pure Jewish race. And so the idea of that intermingling, but what's interesting, I thought, despite the fact that they have very traditional and what I would equate with traditional Christian views around marriage, they actually have a pretty loose view on transgenderism. But where the stipulation is if you are going to be a transgendered person, you can be married in the Baha'i faith once you have surgically reassignment, sex reassignment surgery. You have to actually go through the process of changing your parts so that then you can be considered that other sex, and then you can get married. So in one sense, a very traditional view of marriage and sexuality, but then there's this weird provision, but that's where that doesn't seem congruent, but the reality is when unity of humanity is sort of the goal, there's a sense of uplifting humanity. So it was an aberration that I thought was interesting. All right, where are we at? Sort of got off topic, but let me go back to real quick the history and give you just sort of and the history only goes back to the early 1800s. There was a guy who they called Bob, or he called himself Bob, and he was to be considered sort of the John the Baptist of the Baha'i faith. In other words, he was the prophet that came before, but he's considered the eighth prophet. In that sequence of 9, and so he was born 1819, lived till 1850, and in 1844, 6 years before he was executed for heresy, he prophesied a new world order, and that there would be another divine messenger that would follow him. And Islam said, you're messing with Muhammad's, importance, you're reinterpreting this. And when he was 25, he was executed, or no, he started the prophecy when he was 25, and then he was executed for heresy, along with several thousand of his followers.
Where was this at?
That I don't know. Somewhere in, I don't know, Iran. I mean, originated in Iran, somewhere in the Middle East. I don't know.
Wouldn't have thought of that for Bob, huh?
What's that?
Big name Bob in the Middle East.
Yeah, B-A-B, Bob. And that means gate or door, and they saw that he saw himself as the gate or the door. And so anyway, in 1817 to 1829, a character by the name of Baha'u'llah came along, and he claimed to be the prophet that Bob prophesied about, and is considered the next major prophet after Jesus Christ and Muhammad. He, in 1863, was exiled and imprisoned because he believed he was the fulfillment of the Abrahamic, of the Davidic promise for a Messiah to come. So in the same way, and to keep in mind, Jews thought Cyrus the Great, who released from the Persian Empire the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, the Jews thought in Isaiah's prophecy of the suffering servant that this was Cyrus the Great. Now, Christianity would say, no, it's Jesus. Islam would say, no, it's Muhammad. And Bob, being the prophet that prophesied the coming, or the John the Baptist prophet that said the prophet is coming, would say that Baha'u'llah was the final prophet. Although there is a prophet, I don't even know where I wrote it down on my notes. What's that? Iran, there you go. So where it began. So, and this is where it gets interesting. Now you have a little bit of a monarchy, because there's a succession of several. So Baha'u'llah's son, Abdul Baha, was born in 1844 to 1921, so around the turn of the century, was Baha'u'llah, the prophet's son, and he carried on the work. And he, from 1911 to 1912, lectured in the US and in Europe. And it was, think about turn of the century, 1911 to 1912, he was talking about the equality of men and women and racial unity. So he must have been looked at as like a crazy nut at the time, because that was
people at the lectures.
no, and not that would have, but this is when and again, there weren't that many Baha'i. In 1910, there were only, or 1950, there were only 200,000. In 1910, there must have, I don't know, I didn't get the stats on all of it, there were obviously less than 200,000. But enough of a world religion that still commanded the attention of lecturers throughout Europe and the US. And then his son, Shogi Effendi, born 1897 to 1957, was considered the guardian of the faith from 1921 until 57. In other words, he was given an elevated role. And all three of their writings are considered sacred texts. Now, keep in mind, when I say sacred text, they don't have the same view of perfection and inerrancy of the scripture that we still hold to. Sacred text means these are the texts of people pursuing the divine, not the perfection of any, there was no text that was the perfect incarnation or the perfect revelation of God. Okay, any questions on that?
Where do these people get those ideas? I mean, they just dream this stuff up. I don't understand what inspired them
A revelation.
from.
I don't know if any of you listen to Jordan Peterson. Conservatives and liberals alike dislike him, which is probably why I like him. But he is a psychopsychologist or psychoanalyst of some sort, and he talks about how revelations become stories, become they then are given meaning by the community and eventually grow. So in other words, it's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen the video that was circulating in the last 20 years, it was probably the first part of the 2000s, of a social theory around it's not trend starters that start trends. It's not the first person to do something that starts a trend, it's the second person. And they have this video of this guy on a side of a hill just dancing like at a concert, and no one else is around him dancing. He looks like a nut, just doing his own thing. You're like, that guy's on drugs. He's got to be. Yeah, and then the second guy, so nothing's happening. He's just out there looking like a nut. And then the second guy gets up and starts dancing with him. And then a third one comes, and then 30 seconds later, the whole hillside is a bunch of people dancing. So similar principle. What was it you just said?
McDonald's. You had the guys that started it, and Ray Kroc brought it and turned it into the biggest.
Yeah, the second guy, yeah.
Yeah, second guy.
Starbucks too. I mean, Starbucks was originally a home coffee company, and Howard.
There's a guy that sees it, there's a limited scope of it, and then second guy is taking all of that in and really then sees the big picture as the theory I understand.
Yeah. That works on all sorts of levels.
Now, are there still family members that are, you talk about sons, are there more offspring of these people?
I'm sure there are, but
who are high up, or?
I'm sure there are, but those three figures or those three writings, not including Bob, are considered the primary sources. And so again, this is a cursory glance. I didn't dig down too deep into how it is. I mean, it's expressed today in a lot of ways, and it's growing. But I think honestly, it's probably growing because it's just an open and accepting faith.
Anything goes.
What's that?
Anything goes.
I don't know. No, I mean, it's pretty rigid in what they expect of them.
So do they, afterlife, is that?
Okay, well, let's get into that, and we'll go over that. Let me tell you how they're similar, and then I'll give you some of the uniqueness of it. So their view of God is that is singular God, so monotheistic, that it's a personal God, that we have an encounter with personal God, but that God is distant, so it's impersonal as well. So in other words, but there is a commitment to that God that makes that. And my guess is, and the personal kind of threw me off because I think the rest of it is a little bit more. I guess we have the same thing. We believe God is omnipotent and all powerful, yet we have a personal relationship with God. But they wouldn't jump into the same level of personal relationship. There's still a distance there. Inaccessible, that we can't understand that God is who God is. In the fullness of God's being, omniscient and omnipresent, imperishable, the almighty creator of all things, that God is timeless, and that God is aware of the created order and wills the direction of time and human history through these messengers. Baha'i faith, of those who adhere to that, refer to God only in titles or attributes, as an almighty or all loving or are powerful. They don't actually have a name or sign. And actually their dating system is different too, that one of them, I think Bob reset it, and they actually go in a lunar cycle of 19 months of 19 days for each month. And each month is named after an attribute of God. So in other words, even their calendar system that they use is, again, I mean, based on the lunar cycle, but the calendar itself is meant to bring glory to God, which I thought was really interesting, as opposed to Augustus naming it after emperors and things.
Well, what is like December, what attribute do they attribute to that?
I didn't write down all the different months.
You could have at least given us one.
I don't have, what, did I write down one?
No, I'm kidding.
I don't think I did. So that's God, that's who God is. So they have a very similar view of God that we do. Like there's nothing other than the title thing, and the fact that there's different ages of God's manifestations. All of those things, personal, I mean, I wouldn't say God is inaccessible, but in some sense, in the sense of the fullness of God, God is inaccessible. We get glimpses, we get revelations, we don't get the fullness. I mean, Moses went up and got even a partial fullness of God and came back white-haired and aged.
We don't have that capacity.
Well, we probably don't. I mean, and maybe we will in the end, we'll be given that capacity. But yeah, I think any of us, it's kind of like if you actually stood before God properly, the existence of your being would be absorbed or obliterated or something, I don't know. But you would definitely be affected. And so they believe that humanity, the aim of humanity, ours is to glorify God, and theirs aim is to know and love God through prayer, reflection, and service. Not too bad, eh?
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And I would say, and for those of you non-Catholics here, faith-seeking understanding is the same concept, that we understand God through our intellects because we're rational beings. And they actually have a word. They actually have a word for it, and they refer to humanity as having a rational soul, and that what they're referring to is our ability to perceive God and the divine and our relationship to the divine, and therefore our perception is possible through our conscious recognition, and we respond to God through obedience, through service and prayer. So, and the desire or the goal is the closeness of God, and that plays into their view of the afterlife, of the notion of there is no heaven or hell, and again, of a physical distance, that there's not a place that you're going to go burn, and there's not a place you're going to go play golf and have gold streets or anything to that, but actually it's like God is an energy or a light or a being, and the closer, and those who are redeemed are closer to that light or being, and those who are not are farther away in distance, and that distance is considered hellish or torment. And I'll be honest with you, that image is actually that image is not foreign to Christianity as well as an end. The idea that God is some sort of, and that's the challenge that we have, and they would acknowledge this, that to even talk about God in terms of human terms, we're failing left and right, because the brokenness and limited nature of human communication, we can't truly, again, that's the inaccessible nature of God. We don't have language truly, but as it says in Corinthians, God was pleased by the foolishness that was preached. So although we're preaching foolishness or things that are wrong, God's pleased by that, and I take delight in assurance in that.
Jason, do
Yeah.
they have a service when they worship?
They don't actually have, I mean, there are not, I think 9 Baha'i temples around the world on 9 sides, and they're beautiful. I mean, they're stunning if you go type it in and look at pictures of them. But they have home devotional meetings is what it was called. And there are Baha'i centers or temples. And only sacred texts are allowed to be read in the Baha'i centers, which include the original revelation, the writing of the generational prophets or wise or holy people, and all the sacred texts of all those 9 faiths or 8 faiths. So the Bible can be read in a Baha'i temple because it's acknowledged as a holy text. I don't know whose Bible, if it's the Apocrypha, if it's the Roman Catholic Bible. I don't know how they're gauging that, but probably the Catholic. Probably is. Actually, it probably is. Oh, come on in. You're welcome. You're hikers. We teach I'm teaching a world religions class on Baha'i. I'm the minister here, but you're welcome to come in and join us, or you're welcome to hang out. We're actually going to be for another 15 or so. Otherwise, well, it's closed this evening, but I'll leave it open for you. But I'm Jason. Yeah. Otherwise, it opens at 9 tomorrow.
At 9.
me too.
Okay, yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. They believe in death, that the soul is separated from the body in death, and that they will be judged for their deeds. And again, the reward is, it's not reward and punishment, it is separation and closeness or presence. They do not believe in embalming or cremation. They believe in letting the body just go to rot as it should. I didn't really get too deep into that, other than that was something they believe. I don't know exactly why. I guess would just be because it's more natural. The embalming, what are we embalming for? To preserve the body from decaying. It's kind of like, I don't know if you ever know this, but when you buy a coffin, you have to decide whether you want a bottom on it.
What?
You could want
You
that?
have to decide whether you want the bottom on the coffin.
Oh, the bottom.
So you can have a bottomless coffin. So it's like a biodegradable bottom so that the worms can actually get to you. And in these days in modern day cemeteries, they actually have a vault that they put on top of it.
Yeah.
That usually it's an entire enclosed, sarcophagus where your body's just going to be in there and petrify itself. Or you can have one open, and if you have a wood casket, the theory is the worms will eventually eat the wood casket or break down, and your body will eventually break down. But the body will break down long before that casket
So what
does.
do they do with them?
They just,
They went in the street?
Mm,
When they die?
no,
Yeah, I mean, do they have a place where they take bodies?
they just don't embalm them. They still bury them. Yeah, they still bury them.
Well, they bury.
But they
okay.
just don't cremate, but they don't embalm them because they want the body to deteriorate.
Okay.
So,
So they don't think ashes are okay.
no, and honestly, there are a lot of Christians who also, although I'm personally okay with cremation, there are a lot of Christians who are not, in part because of the bodily resurrection. But I think God's much bigger than that, So don't worry if Paul's going to make it to heaven. Our God is much bigger. I'm sure that eventually your body's going to return to ashes anyways. So unless you embalm, it'll take a little longer, and then it'll be some. And honestly, that's a whole nother issue. Like, having done a lot of funerals and services and things like that, embalm, when they doctor up a body to have an open casket, it is 99.991% of the time is a horrible idea, because it never looks like the person.
No.
And everyone's last image of the person that they're trying to say goodbye to is some freakish distortion that looks like Michael Jackson, where the face is pulled and the nose is pointy. No, it happens all over the time. And everyone says, even loved ones, and it's just weird. So, it's not my favorite practice, but if any of you want to be shown open casket here, let me know, and I'll still honor your wishes in that. And in the end, that they believe that there will be a lasting peace, and that's the goal. And they call that the most great peace. The three principles that they believe in are the unity of God, and that's the unity and within that, they also believe that science and religion are complementary. And they believe that what science has revealed, as just much as religion has been a progression or an advancement, that our understanding of the natural world is advancing as well. And so they would acknowledge things like evolution and that whole process, obviously, because if you're going to acknowledge Zoroastrianism or Sabianism that predates that, then you would have all of that would be in line with a sense of the evolution of some sort of natural process. They believe in the unity of religion, obviously, but major religions, and this comes back into the Joseph Smith thing, and maybe if I don't think they would probably acknowledge what if Joseph Smith had, they probably would acknowledge that's a cult of some sort, because now that they have 9, I actually, as I was thinking that, I was like, how'd this Bab guy get in here? I know he was the John the Baptist character, but he's the only one who wasn't a major prophet. I mean, John the Baptist is a major prophet for us, but we hold him in a subcategory, not in the same category as Christ. So, and I think and my guess is, and I'm putting it together, is maybe this is where that sense of, because one of the prophecies said that in another 1,000 years after Babula, that there would be another prophet. But if that's the case, then, and he was the Messiah, then what's the other prophet needed for? Again, I didn't dig that. I didn't go down that path. Where they really be sort of shine as a religion, and I think why we're seeing more and more people probably turn to in the growth is in their concept of the unity of humanity. So unity of God, unity of religion, and unity of humanity. The equity or equality of all human beings in a sense of oneness, and the abolishment of all prejudice is their sort of central drive. They have a vast appreciation for diversity, hence wanting to, even though still wanting an intermingling. And I think that's actually interesting because they both are celebrating the diversity that God placed within humanity. And I think we see that in go be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We see that twice, that commandment or that covenant. We see that in the Tower of Babel when they're trying to unify things and become one nation. God's like, I'm going to make you into lots of different nations. And so there is a sense of that God wants diversity in the earth, and I think from a Christian perspective, because God wants unity in those who say our true essence is spiritual, not physical. So although there's diversity and we're spread and we're seeing this expansion, the unity is not meant to be in our earthly, material bodies or beings or lives. The unity is meant to be like, oh, there's something about us that is above and beyond this world, and we find unity in that. As a consequence, racism, all the isms they see that are impediments to humanity being unified, and they also believe in that eventually that they will eliminate categories of wealth and poverty.
It's really paradoxical because the opposite of diversity is
Unity or homogeneity.
Yeah, right. And so it's like, appreciate diversity, but they anticipate in the long term, everything will be the same.
Yeah, and I think I would say that Christianity buys into that a little bit to some extent of our unity comes in our identity in Christ. The problem is we fashion on the identity in Christ after our own cultural experience, enculturation of the unity, And so even, I think I think in the Western, and I struggle with this myself. Like, should I go off and be a missionary somewhere in some far, because I'm like, is the Western culture poisoned Christianity so much that we can't even see ourselves clearly or accurately? And I can point to dozens of books that make that very argument, that we are a consumeristic, marketing-based, wealth-based culture, and that if Christ came back in this present day, we would be the Pharisees. So yeah, let that rest well. Let that help you rest well tonight. They have a strong notion of covenant, and this is kind of like confession. But what's interesting about it is that they believe in people who have to make a covenant to the idea that there is no inspired or authoritative interpretations of Scripture that come from individuals. So there's no freedom for the individual Baha'i faith people to have a unique interpretation of a sacred text.
Those prophets did.
No, in present day. In other words, as you look back, it's not your job to interpret the text and make it what you want it to be. You have to adhere to the central teachings, which are fairly open and accepting, but you can't deviate from that. And so in other words, we as Christians would be like, no, this is, we believe that Christ is the only way. They would be like, well, you can't be a Baha'i then. But I don't know if they would actually say that, but because there is some sense of, again, loose Christology, it would allow you to, but it's the same concept. I don't think you can be a Christian anything. Christian, Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, none of these work. Because we are a faith that believes in divine revelation and the exclusionary nature of Christ being the fullest incarnation of God. No one else has that, so that's our corner in the market.
So if they accept the Bible and it could be read in their temples as sacred, there are places in the Bible that says no one comes to the Father except by me.
Well, that's why that goes back to, that goes back to the idea that, I don't know where I wrote it, the laws and customs can change, and the Bible contains the essence and substance of faith for that time and place. So the idea that at that time and place, that was necessary truth, that expanded the truth, but each Islam, there is in fact an expansion or a correction or a realignment of Christianity as it carries on.
So when Islam came on, they said the Christian religion kind of stopped.
No, not that it stopped. Anyway, the Judaism stopped because Christianity came on the scene, but it evolved, it progressed.
So we're an inferior religion now, you're hold to that?
Yes, but I don't know if they would necessarily say inferior. I would say that Christianity was a part of the outflowing of God's manifestation, for revealing himself.
Anyway, it was good for that time.
It was good for that time and place, and still contains truth, but that was for the time and the place. Very contextual. Let's go through the categories that we have, and then we can and then open it up if there's any final sort of questions. Their experiences or their practices, from 15 on, you're expected to participate in fixed daily prayers and meditation and service. And so for those in more evangelical traditions, we call this the age of accountability. For those in mainline traditions, we often associate that with confirmation. You're confirmed in the Presbyterian Church, you're confirmed as a voting member. So Silas, for example, is considered a full member of the Presbyterian Church, but when he goes through confirmation and we as a session confirm him as a educated voting member, this is why when I do my Being Reformed class, I teach about the government and how we operate and how we function as a Presbyterian Church, because really what you're doing in confirmation, all the biblical stuff really should already have been taught. What we're doing is saying now you need to know the particularities of the Presbyterian faith tradition so that you can be an active and responsible member in the governance of this body. And so Silas can do that at age 13. Silas could actually be an elder at the age 13 once we confirm it. So we have a similar system, in other words. They do not have the same, although that their sacrifice obviously plays a role in the history of all of these faiths, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There is no sense of modern day sacrifice in the same way. They do have sacrifices that they give or practices they participate in but they don't believe in monasticism. So you're not meant to be, you're always meant to be in community. You're not meant to be an ascetic doing your own thing for your own spirituality off somewhere. You're meant to be in community and connected. And in that regard, they do have practices like in the month of March for 19 days, they fast. It's like considered their big fast, or again, the numbers are important to them. After your needs are met with your finances, 19% of the excess is meant to be given to the church or to the Baha'i Central,
It's not the retirement things.
It's
Your expenses.
It's kind of like, it's your expendable income. Now, who defines what personal need or, I don't know. I mean, that's probably it. Again, and honestly, in every faith, you always have people who interpret things, very rigidly. You've always people who interpret things liberally in any faith. So I guarantee you within, like I said, the guy from The Office, Dwight from The Office is a Baha'i. And, there's a lot of room, there's a lot of wiggle room, I think, in Baha'i. As long as you're not promoting prejudice and you're promoting unity. And I think that's the fundamental thing. If you are in engagement in service and practices that promote unity and peace, you're probably doing pretty good.
Do they have priests?
I didn't.
Or services or?
They do have priestly type religious leaders, but no, there are services, and basically it would be joint sort of readings or recitations, and they do happen. Those things do happen in the Baha'i centers, but there aren't many of them, and so most of it actually happens in the home. It's a very home-based group. They call them, like I said earlier, home devotional meetings. They don't really have sacraments in the same way, other than the fact that they acknowledge the sacraments that come throughout the different religions. But the two that I could sort of tease out that might have service as being a huge thing, I think they might consider that as a sacrament. Like it's considered central. You can't not serve. Like it's not you can't fulfill that sense of unity in yourself because it is always in relationship to the other that you're serving. And marriage is very much, there's a high regard for marriage and how that looks.
They have a sacrament.
And that's because I don't know if it'd be, yes, it's considered sacramental. Sacrament, our understanding of sacrament is something that was ordained by Christ. In the Catholic Church, we have 7, and Protestant Church, we have 2. But those are things that Christ, or in the case of the apostolic, fathers, those things are given to us as ordinances to do to maintain the faith. In the same way, I would say work is a necessity, meditation, prayer, that sort of thing is a necessity, but not in the same, again, because we're relying on one figure to give us these ordinances, as Islam, as Judaism, in some of the similar ways would. I mean, circumcision is still considered sacramental in Judaism, in that regard.
Jason, do they have a symbol, cross, crescent, star?
They do, and I'd have to show it to you. No, you're right. The Hiker Center is open from 9 to 6. Do you have accommodations?
My problem.
Okay, all right. I do post these things online. Yeah, that's right. And honestly, I let them, they can stay here as long as they want. But just not right this very second. They can stay right now too. Time, they view it as cyclical, that there really isn't an end. It just continues on. And perhaps when this most great peace is finally realized, it would be kind of like you're in heaven, but there is no sense of, I did not find, and again, I'm just doing a surface glance, a eschatology that says the world's going to be destroyed, and a new heaven and a new earth is created in the same way we look at it. And honestly, we don't always look at it the same way. They have a book which contains the writings of those prominent figures, and they call it the Kibati Aqueduct or something like that. It means the most holy book. And that, along with the other sacred texts, are all considered sacred. But those texts, those final revelations that came for, whatever the guy's name is, Baha'u'llah, that those letters, those writings, and again, their sacred texts are more, Christianity has the most rigid view, or the most inerrant view of scriptures, that and we talk about those in the church history series. We'll talk about that in the Protestant Reformation, why we as a culture in the last 500 years have necessitated that the Bible is considered perfect and inerrant. Most other religions, Judaism included, Islam included, don't have that sense or that need for inerrancy. That's what we broke free from the Pope. We needed to have something to hinge the authority on, so the written word became the authority, and we elevated it to a level that no other religion has viewed their sacred texts. Sacred texts, holy texts, are those texts that are set apart because they contain the history of humanity's pursuit to understand the relationship between the divine and human, not because they were verbatim given by God to the individual to guide and direct. Not that that couldn't have or didn't happen in instances, but the collection of things that we have that we call the Bible, 60 books or 70 some if you're Catholic, that those don't have to be perfect in order to be sacred. Whereas I think evangelicalism says if you don't consider them perfect, then they're no longer sacred, which I think is a false dichotomy and an unhelpful one at best. They have festivals based on their calendar years. Again, 19 months, 19 days a year. They have a new year. It happens at the end of that fasting period in March. After the 19 days, there's the new year. They have days of celebration or festivals around Bab and Baha'u'llah. And they have lots of myths. Shouldn't surprise, obviously. All of these have mythology in all of them. But two of the most common ones are the 7 valleys and the 4 valleys, which deal with the path to God. Particularly the 7 valleys is like the stages of the soul, of how the soul gets and reaches and connects with God. But again, within a mystical, they're viewed as a very mystical faith in that regard too. So they believe in that sense of transcendence, and I don't think you can look at Christianity or any of these world religions and not understand some sense of transcendence between the divine and the human. Did I miss anything? I don't think I did. I probably missed a lot, but nothing on my notes that at least I wanted to cover. So that's what I got today. So now everything else from this point forward will be pure speculation. Questions? Yeah.
I would assume if they don't want nationalism, they wouldn't participate in a war, so that
No,
the country.
no. No, because they would want mediation to happen between those, like, you know, a war, people against, any type of person against person conflict would be considered an affront. So.
Do they have divorce?
They do have provisions for divorce, but again, because the family and the marriage are considered the basic foundation of the building blocks of society, they would frown upon it, obviously, but like many Judeo-Christian, you know, expressions, we have allowances. So, back here, no?
Yeah,
Nice and loud?
in the scriptures.
Our scriptures?
No, the scriptures, the Bahá'í scriptures.
Oh.
I remember reading that, and it scared me at the time, now I feel really stupid about it, because our Bible says the same thing, only about Jesus. But it does say, in the end, they don't know how it will happen, but everyone will worship Allah.
Yeah. Because he's the Messiah figure for them.
He's the Messiah figure for them, and we, you know, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess, is what we say.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Is that, do you know, is that the destruction of the world and a recreation, or is it?
They didn't say that. They were vague about the scriptures are vague about
Yeah.
how it will all happen, but that everybody will, the unity part sounded so appealing to me, but the part that kind of frightened me away at the time was that, you know, this one person will be worshiped. That's why I was wondering if any of them ever consider themselves a step along the way, just like the other religions are. Or
No, I would say no.
It seemed more like they were the pinnacle. And
Yes,
they-
that's hence the 9, because 1 and 0 are needed to make 10, but 9 is the complete fullest expression. But that's why I think this weird Bob guy in the middle, I was like, you know, that throws off the count. For me, it throws off the count. So, any other thoughts, questions, ruminations? All right, well, let me shut this off and then we can